Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the session. I'm Malachy Brown. I work at the New York Times on the visual investigations team. I'm joined by my colleague Yusra Al-Lu, who works with us on several projects, and Meg Kelly from the visual forensics team at the Washington Post. And let's just go on to the next one. Just a word of warning before we get into it. There are some slides that contain distressing images, and some of the topics today are pretty hard going as well. But in today's session, I'm moderating at the moment, but I'm also going to present some slides followed by Meg. And what you're going to get from us today is, how we think about using visual and digital evidence, the on-the-ground reporting that Yusra has been doing, focusing on along with Masha Froliak in Bucha last year. It was led to a series of investigations and a half-an-hour investigative film that you'll hear a bit more about. Meg's going to focus on more of the remote reporting, and hopefully and also on the ground reporting, and like how the superpower is really the combination of both of those forms. And then we're going to touch on a few other things, some tools and computer assisted reporting, like just really some really just touching on that a little bit. And throughout all of this, I think, we're not going to get too, at least I'm not going to get too detailed on the reporting, but rather the methods. OSINT and geolocation and chronolocation is well understood now, and we're sort of, focusing more on the common methods through all of these types of investigations and reports, and connecting dots, detecting patterns, finding facts, and how we collect and organize material through it. So straight into it. This was a week-long story after the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. He was shot by two men in South Georgia, and there were dueling narratives around what happened to him. Was he out for a jog and accosted, or was he a thief? And was this a warranted citizen's arrest that turned ugly? And literally, this is just one lunchtime. There were only 2 or 3 videos of the event of him entering the neighborhood. And this is literally from my Google Doc, just sketching out where he went and then where he was shot. And so, he disappears down this road out of frame when a truck pulls out of a driveway, follows him. And next time he's running towards a truck that matches that description, and he's shot dead. And what happened in between? And so by calling up our local reporter, Richard Fawcett, he obtained 911 calls, and it was possible to see that those calls were made during those videos. And also in the file names of the 911 calls, there were timestamps. And we cross-corroborated that with the reports, the dispatcher's logs as well, just to double check that. But that now gives us a time frame for the period in which he was pursued by these people in trucks. And it was for up to 5 minutes. And just to, verify that what you're hearing in the 911 call is what you're hearing from the back of the truck just as he's shot, just by going into Adobe Audition or another audio software and lining up those audio signatures, you're able to detect artifacts in there that confirms it. In addition to the police forgot to redact the phone number that the 911 call came from, and by tracing that phone call, we knew it came from one of the men that was involved in the killing. And so it's just combining, these little factoids from disparate pieces of evidence to string it together. And then this is something that we, always do. Really, is chronology as your friend. Because there are different timestamps in CCTV, 911 calls, 911 dispatch logs, the metadata of the videos. Choose the best one, which is the time the 911 call was made, and synchronize everything up against that so you get an accurate timeline. And it's the detail within that then that gives you really good storytelling as well. And so, that was that. The judge cited the 5 minutes that he was pursued when he sentenced the men to federal hate crimes. Iran plane strike. Even though we don't know where these videos are, there are 3 videos that show pretty much the same thing, a fireball crashing down, the same glare and period. So you can kind of, it's like, who's your first source, second source, third source? If you've got 3 sources uploading video at the time of the crash, this might be, a starting point for us. We very often plot our information on Google Earth. It's a free tool. It's great to use. It very much can help you visualize a story and, reporting targets and leads. And so this is the first thing that we did that night. Actually, we were working on that together. Yeah, was get the flight path, put that into Google Earth, and then start plotting out around that. And then also listening to local Telegram channels, so that when a few days later, Iran was denying they'd shot down the plane at the time, but this video emerged right while we were monitoring those Telegram channels. One of the team kicks it over. We geolocate it very quickly while somebody else is on the phone to the uploader and asking the questions. At the time, people on Twitter had been reporting hearing a couple of explosions and seeing a fireball. And so one of the questions we asked this guy was, well, why did you start filming? And he said, well, I heard an explosion, started filming, and then I saw this second thing. And it's a missile hitting the plane. And so we're testing our hypothesis here that the plane was hit by one missile, its transponder knocked out, and then by geolocating that video, we can see where that second missile hit. We know the altitude, the approximate speed of the plane, the direction that it's heading in, and so even though we're relying on one piece of video on this person's account, we're also looking at the information within that, such as the sound. We know the distance that the plane is from the camera. You see the missile strike, you hear the explosion 11 seconds later. Does that tally with the distance the plane was, knowing everything that we know? And so that's some of the verification that we would do, and upload that. That's a really quick hour-and-a-half breaking news type of use of this, information. Finding the Pentagon leaker, totally different. We didn't start with we're not responsible for the picture that you're seeing here, just to state that. Find his Discord friends. So we teamed up with Arik Toller of Bellingcat at the time, and he had been contacted by some of the gamers. This is a young man, young American air serviceman who had access to classified information and leaked it onto Discord, where he was hanging out with gaming friends. And several of them, from what they told us and what they told Arik, we were able to, we had access to the chats that he had in there. We knew their Steam profiles, so we went onto Steam. We knew what games they like to play together. If you're subscribed to Patreon, you're able to get onto Steam UK, steamid.uk, which gives a history of Steam accounts, their former friends, and what they call themselves over time. And so by pulling all of that information from these friends of the gamer and who played games with him, we did a network graph of it, and then focused in on one person of interest. There was a couple of people there, but he kind of matched the profile from the games that they played together. And then that Steam profile led out the historic Steam profiles from the very first username that was registered on Steam, led out to a Flickr account that led to an Instagram account that led to other social media accounts. And meanwhile, a couple of us were trying to competing with the Post to reel in more documents. And when some of the documents arrived, they were photographed on a granite countertop with white tiles at the bottom. And on the one of the family members' Instagram accounts, they had taken loads of photographs inside the family home, and so we could show that it was taken on that countertop. And then we ran some other information down, and it was him. We didn't publish this until we got to speak to the family, but the authorities arrived very quickly. So it's a mix of just turning over rocks on the internet, seeing what patterns are there, putting it together. Very quickly then, Breonna Taylor. The police didn't wear their body cams when they conducted the raid that killed her. Her name became synonymous with, protests and activism around racial justice in the US in 2020. And so the public's view, because there was no footage of what happened, was really occluded and clouded by that fact. And that was evident even down in Louisville, just talking to people who weren't quite sure. Again, dueling narratives. And although there was none of this, we managed to get our hands on crime scene evidence, and that contained a lot of photographs showing that, you know, almost every room in her apartment was riddled with bullet holes. And so using that was the sort of the starting point to start sketching out and modeling the crime scene and what happened there using the police testimony. So Anjali Singhvi teamed up with our unit, and we created this over a couple of months using Blender, which is an open source 3D modeling software. And again, it was the photographs that allowed us to do photogrammetry as well as floor plans and taking photographs around. We couldn't get access to the apartment, but we took photographs around the building using satellite imagery as well. It gives you kind of an accurate representation. That was Anjali's work. And again, you know, the police officers were deposed. You can see that they're sketching out what their movements were. There were 7 of them there. Some misremembered things, but between the aggregate and who is standing where, who's standing behind who has the best view, you're able to get a sense of what happened, who's saying what, how quickly all of this happened. It's close to midnight. There's no lights on. All of those details sort of came out, and so this is us just sketching their movements and then inserting those movements in their own words into the model and showing what happened, and showing just the sort of the story of both sides of that door, really. What they heard inside. Breonna Taylor was asleep when this started. Her boyfriend was watching television, and the door came down within 30 seconds. And even little storytelling details, like the fact that there's only one light there in that entranceway. And so the police, who are not dressed as lightly as this, they're in jeans and, you know, plain clothes, dark tops, they're also silhouetted when they burst in that door. And so the boyfriend fired off a low shot, as he said. He was interviewed right afterwards. He didn't want to hurt anybody, and they returned fire. And so this is what that looked like. And so what was also striking was the police investigation into this. They really focused on the neighbors and whether the police announced their presence correctly. That was really all that they wanted to hear. So by putting the witness testimony and showing the proximity to that doorway, and none of them hearing that the police announced themselves correctly, was kind of damning. And it challenged the Attorney General's exoneration of the 2 officers that were responsible for killing her. And then a few tidbits before I pass it over. Before and after satellite imagery, if Russia denies that, you know, they had anything to do with dozens of people being killed in Bucha, you know, looking at before and after shows that those bodies were there while Russia controlled the area, and actually you can see the Russian tanks in the buildings around it. User is going to go into a lot more detail about that. You know, very often at the outset, while we're prospecting something like Bucha, we're going to plot and rough out what we're seeing and where we might try to develop stories, and that can help with story parameters. Obviously you want to keep an open mind, but again, just like in terms of spatially and temporally plotting out what you might be looking for, it'll open up leads. You know, other satellite data. Benjamin Strick is giving a presentation here. He's the expert on all of this. And our tip sheet, when we upload it, will link out to some of his presentations on this stuff. But, you know, heat signatures, even a lot of them might be forest fires, but if they're happening around roads in the Tigray region and you order up satellite imagery, that might be the starting point for an investigation as well. If it's cloudy, satellite radar can help see through clouds, depending on the objects. Topaz is a tool that we've used. You know, occasionally, if there's a blurry sign and you're trying to OCR what the language is, so you get a location, that can be helpful. Other times, if you're looking at what's on top of what books Clarence Thomas is reading and it's too far away, it doesn't work like that. Computer vision. When you see a satellite image, it's a composite image of red, green, and blue as a satellite flies over top, and it's all sort of stitched together and lined up so that you get a ground view. When there was a lot of interest in the Chinese balloon that floated over America, we talked to Synthetic is the name of the company, and they have software that can detect objects, and so they drew what would appear to be a red, green, and a blue blob of a white balloon over the ground in satellite imagery. and their software picked it up. So we were able to basically trace the balloon from 2 hours after its launch and kind of solve that mystery of where it came from and confirm that it came from there. So just to give a couple of examples of computer vision tools and that are coming down the tracks, identification of objects like different models of helicopters in satellite imagery, the Preligens. They've done the same with ships. They can take like a port scene and identify all the different ships. It's just clever use of AI paired with imagery. This is V-Frame. They're working to model different types of munitions. So if you have a large trove of videos, you will be able to detect objects in the videos. This isn't facial recognition, but facial matching and trying to follow people through troves of CCTV, in this case Bucha, but equally applicable to the Capitol riot, which Meg will present later on. And then scraping, we all scrape, and then, social platforms for information. And, if you're looking for death notices so that you can rule out, the deaths of pets and whatnot that are being reported, you can put in, pictures. You can do it like apply a visual filter to that. It might give you like a high quality spreadsheet to work through that match different search terms. So just some of the tidbits on computer assisted reporting that we experiment with. Okay, Meg.
Which button is it? Hi, I'm Meg Kelly. I'm a reporter with the Washington Post. I work on our visual forensics team. I wanted to talk a little bit about how sort of open source and visual evidence can be useful in different scenarios, especially more and more in situations where reporting on the ground can either be too dangerous, too difficult to get to, or where you're in a situation where the evidence that you present has to be so indisputable. Witness testimony is not enough. And so I want to talk through a couple of different case studies that my team has done over the last few years. So to start with, I want to sort of go back to 2021. This story starts more than sort of 6 months after the military coup in Myanmar, and it's in Chin State, which is sort of a primarily Christian region in the northwest of Myanmar. It's near the Indian border. And our bureau chief at the time and I started to notice that there were all of these images of fires and videos that showed military convoys and fires coming through. They were popping up across social media. They were popping up in local media. And it wasn't clear what was happening. At this point, she could no longer go into Myanmar. We no longer had a local reporter that was safe to report within Myanmar. And so we started to wonder what was going on, and we were worried because these tactics really recalled the Rohingya massacres that had happened a few years before. So there were similar tactics that were used with fires that were burned, and it was also targeting an ethnic minority. So we did what all my research basically starts with, and we made a spreadsheet. And so we downloaded essentially everything that we could possibly find. And the spreadsheet's a little bit unique in the sense that we use not just an exact date or an exact time, but things that were approximate based on when they were posted on social media. We used approximate locations as well as eventually using more exacting locations. And then we coded all of the footage. So, was there fire involved? Was it military? Was there a video? And some of them were quite tricky to geolocate. This is a very rural part of Myanmar, and so we used, Google Earth, which Maliki already talked about a bit, and the sort of topography features within Google Earth to find the roads, in certain cases, or to find the villages that weren't sort of readily accessibly known on Google Maps. And we pretty quickly realized that within these two pieces of data, so going back to the spreadsheet, we kind of needed to see this timeline geographically. And so we put together, using my maps, we uploaded our CSV of dates and times and locations and coded them based on sort of fires and locations where different military forces had been spotted. And something popped out to us pretty much immediately, which is that they seem to be going in order. So it started in the north, and it started to sort of move towards the south, and then towards the west in chronological space. About the same time, our bureau chief was given some documents that they were exclusively shared with us, and they showed that soldiers were authorized to clear areas between October 4th and October 17th in roughly exactly that same area. And the language that was used was very similar to the language that had been used with the Rohingya. And so we thought, okay, what if we map what these documents say with essentially what we had found in our map? And so the image on the left sort of shows what was in military planning documents. The orange line is where the forces were ordered to go through. The sort of fuzzy orange is the areas that forces were ordered to clear. And it matches almost exactly with where the burned villages were and where we were able to geolocate and chronolocate those military forces. This visual evidence sort of became the first time we could really implicate the actions of the Tatmadaw in the aftermath of the coup. We also worked with Myanmar Witness and Ben Strick, who has a great panel on some of this later today. They were following similar things, and they provided us with some Facebook photos and videos that they had captured of a particularly chatty soldier. He had been based in That Lang. It had all been sort of chronolocated, and the timestamps were consistent. And he uploaded photos of himself showing the fires in the background. He also uploaded photos of himself where you could see his patch from his light infantry division, which allowed us to put together exactly like who was where and when they were there, which led us to wonder, could we say how much of this town had been burned? We worked with a civil organization that had been flying drones over the border from India, and they essentially captured the destruction at various different phases. And so we laid that all out back in a map. And so we tried to quantify by taking these dots, taking them apart, putting it into QGIS and Illustrator, and essentially we could figure out how much had been burned, which really sort of put together who did it, when it happened, and what the ultimate outcome was. And all of this worked sort of across two bands, right? You have satellite imagery and Google Earth and My Maps and QGIS, which are all free and sort of open source tools. A lot of the initial visual evidence was social media or public media visuals. But then it also required the sort of more sensitive and closed source reporting that was done all through secure apps with both the exclusive documents and some interviews and witness statements that were taken and had to be done remotely and using voice memos. The next thing I wanted to sort of chat about was there are times when we have all of the evidence, but there's just one piece missing. And so I want to sort of show you a few examples where we've kind of tried to fill in that piece using different forms of technology. The first is an investigation that we did last year into how Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. She was killed while she was covering a raid in Jenin in Palestine in the spring. And initially, the Israeli forces claimed that there was an exchange of fire and before she was killed, but multiple eyewitnesses that we had interviewed said that there was no firefight at the time. We wanted to sort of untangle this and figure out what happened and see if we could figure out, the origin of the shots. So we started. Once we had collected all of the footage, we built a sync in Premiere, which is a video editing software. I'm sure this is a bit repetitive for some of you, but we used the audio. From various different videos to line it up and match piece by piece. One of the things I always like to point out about this particular project is that the live stream, which became sort of critical both to understanding exactly when she was killed and to piecing together these visuals, at the moment when she's killed, she's pointing towards the ground. So it doesn't give you a visual that is useful, but that audio became incredibly important to the investigation because we were able to give two sources of audio. We were able to give 2 sources of audio to an audio expert who could then line up and measure between the gunshots. And he was able to essentially say that within the sort of burst of gunshot fire, it was shot from 175 to 195 meters away from the cameras that recorded the scene, which were, very close to where she was killed. And then he was also able to say, based on the sound waves and the amount of time between the different bursts of gunfire, that it was a single person from a single weapon. 2 slides. Yeah, so that's the audio. And then we said, okay, well, cool. We now have this distance based on the audio. How do we figure out who did it, right? So we went back to our geolocation, we went back to our maps, and we had an exact timing of when the IDF convoy, where they were and when they were there, and we also had locations of various fighters who had been seen firing earlier that day. When we overlaid it, we realized that working out from where she was killed and using the radius from the audio analysis, it perfectly aligned, or nearly perfectly aligned, with the location of Israeli forces. We also sort of wanted to see, could they see her? There was reports that one of the soldiers had an advanced scope on his weapon. And so this is sort of a lower budget way of trying to figure out what they could see at the time, just done with a focal length and a camera. I would encourage everyone to check out the incredible work that Forensic Architecture did on this. They put together a great documentary in the months that sort of followed. And so this basically talks about how this piece of audio evidence really sort of filled in this gap within this reporting. It sort of filled in this gap of the story. The next story that I wanted to chat to you about is a piece that I didn't work on, but 2 of my colleagues did earlier this summer. And it sort of looks at how hundreds of migrants drowned on Greece's watch. And I think many of you probably remember this story. There were sort of conflicting accounts initially about the final minutes, and the Coast Guard contended that it was being overturned, and then because of sort of panic-induced shifts of weights, and survivors said that, actually it was because of the Coast Guard's actions this happened. So the tracking data, the AIS data for the ship itself had been turned off. But my 2 colleagues figured out that, well, they knew where it had interacted with other ships. So they pulled the AIS data of those ships, and then using SAR imagery, they actually found the ship itself, as well as the location of other ships. And then they were given additional photos and videos that showed it at a different place. When they put that all together in QGIS, they sort of created this master mess of a map. But what it shows is the different paths that were taken. And that helped them calculate the speed because they knew the different points that they had seen it at, and they knew had some different timestamps. When they put that together in Illustrator and in After Effects, then they could really see, where the movements were and fact check some of the claims that were made by the Greek officials. And so it cast doubt on sort of the claims of what the Greek officials said had happened, and suggested that the deadliest wreck was possibly preventable. And so I wanted to sort of point this out because it's a case where we used all of this open source data to put together a picture of a tragedy where it seemed like initially there wasn't a whole lot of data available. The last thing I want to talk to you about is a story I worked on earlier this year, also from Jenin. A 14-year-old boy named Omar Dwan was killed during a raid. He was riding his bicycle. Earlier that day, he'd been, delivering groceries for his father. And then we sort of discovered that there were these 3 cameras that became really important. They showed the street that he was riding down. And this whole interaction happens very quickly. It's 10 seconds. Israeli plainclothes forces pull up in plain cars, and their targets are 2 men, Nidal Kazem and Yusuf Shamir, who are sort of in camera 1. I'm not sure if that's the left side or the right side. And what we realized when we sort of put these videos together is that none of them had a complete viewpoint, and none of them had a complete audio signature. So we were sort of missing this critical gap. We knew that we had a lot of the information, but we didn't have everything. So we thought, is there a way that we can just freeze this moment where Omar falls off his bike? Can we figure out a way to put this all into sort of a simple, understandable space? So my colleague, and so this, sorry, I forgot about this slide. But so this sort of shows the layout of the street, right? So you sort of have these 3 different cameras, and none of them give you the complete picture. So my colleague Imogen used F-Spy software and satellite imagery in addition to the 3 videos, as well as other videos that we had collected from the aftermath, to totally recreate this moment. And so that allowed us to sort of see more clearly exactly what was coming through each of those particular viewpoints, so each of those windows, but also to be able to see what the Israeli forces saw or what was visible from their general perspective at that moment in time. And put together, it let us prove that Omar was among the sort of 16 civilians that were visible on the street at that time, as the officers fired multiple AR-style rifles and a handgun. Within that sort of 10-second period, they killed both militants and Omar. And that's all.
Which one is that? Hi, everyone. I'm Yusra Al-Hilu. I work with Maliki at the Times. I do a lot of hybrid work with VI, so I don't know how to use many of the fancy tools they referenced, but I know how to work in the field. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today was co-reported with my colleague Masha Froliak, who's in the back, and who will be sitting on a panel after this one in this room, titled, I think, The Best of Ukraine's Visual Investigations, or Best of Ukraine Reporting, or Best of Reporting from Ukraine last year. So what I'll do in this session is talk more about kind of just general tools for reporting in the field, how to cultivate sources, how to collaborate with colleagues who have more of a forensic background, and just some deployment tips for stories that have sort of a visual investigations wrapper. So they're based in field reporting, but look like VI. And Masha will actually walk you through how we reported the story with our colleagues back in New York, Christoph, Kettle, Haley, Willis, Dima Kovin, Maliki, and others. Forgive me, I have to do 2 things at once. So just a quick overview of the work that we produced last year. It was an 8-month reporting process that began when Bucha was liberated in early April and ended, I think, around Christmas time, when we always publish our best work and no one watches until after the new year. All of this work relied on field reporting. It was the critical tool. It wasn't an we used OSENT methodology, and we employed and used those skills, but the material was based on traditional on-the-ground field reporting. And a lot of the way we worked in Bucha and in Ukraine last year was modeled after the way Maliki and I worked in Gaza in 2018 when we reported on the killing of a medic by Israeli forces, which was kind of a breakthrough or a revolutionary model for the Visual Investigations Desk, because like the Bucha work, it was really based on material we collected from on-the-ground reporting, field reporting, that human factor or the human touch. And so, you know, whereas a lot of people might assume that the work we do at the New York Times on the Visual Investigations team requires kind of fancy tools, specific technology, I'm here to kind of let you know that that's not always the case, and that there are times when you need to be on the ground to do the most impactful work. And that oftentimes evidence gathering is you're only able to gather your most critical pieces of evidence if you meet with sources face to face, and if you can convince them that you're the right person to give exclusive material to. It's very hard to do that over the phone or from your desk in the comfort of your home in New York City. So just very quickly, why is field reporting critical on VI stories? Like Meg's reporting in Myanmar, I'm presumably was mostly done remotely. Maliki talked about some of the projects we've worked on that are award-winning that were done from our desks in our New York office. But a critical part of our job as reporters is to bear witness. I mean, there are different ways to bear witness. You can bear witness by collecting evidence that you source online. But a critical part of our job is to be on the ground, report, and investigate. Sometimes there are time limits in the sense of, in Bucha, CCTV cameras were recording up until the occupation of Bucha began in early March. Because of an electricity blackout, the cameras stopped recording, but then they started to re-record again when electricity came back on a month later. So if you wanted to capture or collect the most important CCTV, you had to do it very quickly before the cameras were rewriting. So if you needed footage from March 3rd, you had to be on the ground on April 3rd or April 30th. You know, you had about a month window before that footage would be rewritten. So you didn't have the time to wait to cultivate sources from abroad. You really needed to be there to collect those servers. So time is a critical factor. Cultivating sources, whether that's vulnerable populations in conflict areas, people who might not have the phones or signal, people who are traumatized, who don't want to talk to you over Facebook Messenger, or sensitive intelligence officials who don't know who you are, don't care about who you are, but if you're in the field, might invite you over for a 4-hour tea. This is a true story. We had to sit in a meeting for about 4 hours and learn about the history of Russian oligarchs before someone trusted Masha and I with some really sensitive material. I'm sure you've all experienced that. Also, spatial familiarity. A lot of the tools that Meg and Maliki discussed were digital tools that help people understand the environment. I just don't work that way. I don't know how to look at a CCTV camera or UGC footage and place myself there. I need to be there. I need to get a sense of the environment, get a sense of what people on the ground might have gone through, only in the sense of like, what is it like to work or live in an area where there's a blackout or limited electricity. So just familiarity is really important in the way I work. Emotional connection. Ultimately, yes, we're reporters, but we're human beings. And being able to put yourself, even just a fraction, 1% of putting yourself in someone's shoes, like going to the basement where they bunkered for the month during the occupation, can have a lot of impact and influence on how you report the story. It's not just something that you're witnessing from afar through UGC. You're in some way recreating or living through what your sources lived through. Also building a network or a community. By the time we finished our reporting in Ukraine, we'd spent over 150 days last year on the ground, most of it on the same street, Yablonska Street in Bucha. So we eventually, I think initially we were pestering people, but they eventually became our friends. You can't do that. You can build relationships via WhatsApp or via phone calls, but it's very different when someone sees you, knows your background, understands that you're a real human being who really wants to help change the world or bring justice to victims. Also, this is something a lot of panelists have mentioned, digital security and physical security of sources. There's a lot of data that people physically can't share or are too scared to share, even if the messaging app is encrypted. And you're more likely to get that material if you're just there in person with the right phone or the right technology. There's no digital footprint if you talk to someone on the ground. And then also, I already talked about this, but there are limitations. In Bucha, there was a blackout for a month, and electricity wasn't restored for quite some time. So at times, we actually did try to contact sources from New York before we deployed. Or I'm sorry, we were in Ukraine at the time, but we attempted on multiple occasions to reach people by phone, but there was no electricity or the internet was out, so we couldn't physically reach them, so we had to be there. It doesn't mean it's a perfect model. There are a lot of challenges with field reporting for VI. I talked about how long the project took. This sort of the 5 or so stories we worked on last year took about 8 months of reporting. That's a long time. Like, increasingly, newspapers want things out fast. They want them out in a short period of time, and they want them to be short in their length. We were very privileged to be able to produce a nearly 30-minute documentary involving multiple reporters, 2 full-time on-the-ground reporters, Masha and I, half a dozen reporters back in New York and our editors. And you need to convince your editors that the work is warranted. Not every project warrants this length of time. We did also, for example, make 3 trips back to Gaza in 2018. That investigation took 6 months. So the last time I did something like Bucha was in 2018. So it's not every story or every year. It really takes time and it's expensive. You have to book flights, book hotels, have a security advisor, and eat good food every day if you can. And it involves multiple trips. So there's a physical toll, right? You're spending 150 days in an active, ongoing conflict. Can you handle that? And not everyone can, and that's totally understandable. It's also, if it's an active conflict zone, and Meg touched on this, can you get to the places you're reporting on? In the case of Bucha, once it was liberated, we were able to make repeated trips. But if you wanted to report on Bucha back in March, it would have been impossible to be on Jablonska Street then. So you have to decide if it's worth the effort, if you can even to even access the place you want to report on. Building the right team. Masha and I were the field reporters, and we had an incredible team to support our work and vice versa back in New York. You're not always blessed with people who can collaborate with you in a really rewarding way. In our case, we were, but that's, again, not always. The resources aren't always available. Also, if you're on deadline, field work takes time. Everything you collect, every interview in a foreign language needs to be translated. The documents you collect need to be translated. So do you have the time to do that field reporting on the specific story you work on? And then, of course, the psychological toll. It's not easy reporting in the field. It's not easy watching UGC footage. So striking the right balance, risk-reward for being in the field is important. So I want to break up my portion of the presentation into 3 practical, or 3 things that I think are important if you are thinking about deploying for visual investigations focused piece. The first one, the first bit of slides will focus on where to find sources. Sources who can give you data, sources who can give you witness testimony, sources who can give you sensitive and classified documents. Who are they, where are they, how do you approach them? The second will be how to convince intelligence officials, law enforcement officials to give you sensitive data. And in the case of the Bucha reporting, that was a critical, they were critical sources for us. And the third will be deployment tips, kind of what is the hardware you might want to think about bringing if you're going to go to an active conflict zone, for example, and need to collect a lot of data. So I'll just run through them. And Mal, let me know if I'm going over time at any point. So I'll just start off with that kind of first category. Field sources, who are they, where can you find them? This is Victor Shatilo. He's a resident of Bucha who survived the occupation. And I talked about how Masha and I spent over 100 days reporting in and around Bucha. One day when we were thinking about leaving, because it'd been a long day, we kind of convinced ourselves to talk to the man who was picking cherries. And that's exactly what Victor was doing when we met him. And his hands were kind of dirty because he'd been picking his spring cherries, or summer cherries, which were delicious. And as we did every day we were in Bucha, we asked people, were you here during the occupation? Do you have a cell phone? Did it have power? And were you recording any footage? And he kind of shrugged us off, but also gave us his phone. Like, he literally took his phone out of his pocket and said, I don't remember what I have. I don't remember what I recorded. I deleted some of it, but why don't you take a look while I'm washing my hands and tell me if there's anything that can be helpful. Little did Victor know that he had the most important piece of evidence that we based our investigation on, which were time-stamped photos and videos that gave you clear chronology of the way that Russian soldiers killed Ukrainian citizens on a specific day at a specific time. So when he gave us his cell phone, we quickly went to the month of March, because that's the time period we were interested in, and we found a couple of videos that showed his perspective from his attic, where he was holding his camera at great risk to his personal safety, because Russian soldiers were threatening residents that if they had their cell phones and they had captured footage that they could be killed. So this was very brave of Victor to do. But he happened to have cell phone reception for 2 really important days in the occupation of Bucha, where Russian soldiers were killing Ukrainian civilians as they were crossing their path, and their bodies were falling along this critical intersection on Yablonska Street. So his videos and photos gave us exact timestamps of when those victims were killed. I'm sorry, it's graphic, but that's what it looked like when we grabbed his phone. That's the image on top is one of the images he captured of a civilian being killed, and that image paired at the exact same time with some drone footage that we had obtained from a military source that showed the actual military vehicle firing at that civilian. So, sorry, Mel. So, door knock. Don't be embarrassed to talk to random people. Not random. Don't be embarrassed to talk to everyday people on the street. You never know what they will hold quite literally in their pocket. Oh yeah, thanks. I forgot that's actually the clicker. I just have a couple more references of how residents can not only provide witness testimony, but they can provide hard evidence for your story. This is the Schmoot family. They lived parallel to the base, or to an office building that Russians converted into their base during the occupation of Bucha. It was the site where 8 men's bodies were found killed when Russians left Bucha in April. It's a very infamous photo, I think captured by the AP and other outlets, of the 8 bodies that were kind of lying still. 5 more minutes? Oh, okay. Anyway, so they provided us cell phone footage that showed men being walked to their death, basically. And that image paired with the exact time that we saw those men appearing in CCTV footage and in drone footage. The man in the blue shirt was a critical piece of evidence, and our reporting on these men began with their cell phone footage. The man in the blue was Denis Rudenko. He was killed. This is kind of the same topic, and since I only have 5 minutes, but residents at home were taking great risk to capture the motion or the movement of Russian soldiers. This man captured a video that correlated to a very famous image out of Bucha. Just a quick point, the first 2 residents gave us exclusive footage. So this footage was not online. You really had to be there in person. You had to catch those people at the right time. The Schmoot family had left Bucha and had happened to come back for 1 day to pack some belongings and leave again, and we just happened to catch them on that day. Had we not been there to door knock, to speak to them, we wouldn't have that footage today. And same thing with Victor Shatilo. Had he left to visit relatives, we actually tried reaching him by phone before we got to Bucha. He didn't have service or wasn't available. It's just because we were there. Like, this is that was a critical factor. Our presence on the ground was a critical factor. Family members of victims are critical sources of information. When authorities won't give you documents because of security limitations, family members often have access to those documents just because they are relatives and next of kin. So we needed to establish chronology of killings. When did Russians kill Ukrainian citizens in Bucha? We didn't only rely on metadata from cell phones, we relied on official documents like death certificates, and morgue reports, and also text messages. When was the last time that a victim was online, or when was the last time that they messaged that family member? So rely on, when you're facing a roadblock and officials won't give you something, look elsewhere. Owners of CCTV footage, Meg and Mao talked about the CCTV footage they use in their reporting. Most, if not none, none if not all of the footage we used in our piece was exclusive. Let me rephrase. Almost all of the CCTV footage we used in our piece was exclusive. We gathered about 16 terabytes of data. Most of that was CCTV footage captured or taken from these boxes and these computers. Look up. There are CCTV cameras everywhere. They're on street corners, they're on buildings, if land is being developed, Oftentimes they're monitored because there's a lot of tools laying around. So anyway, look and ask. Just because you get access, though, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Like I said, a lot of the footage was being re-recorded on a daily basis, so you need to make sure to get there in time. You need to make sure the cameras are working. The cameras are actually, or the drives or the boxes are working. In some cases, we had to take the boxes and send them to a specialty house and recover that material. In other cases, we had to ask residents to use a generator to plug in the box to give us the footage. You know, they're giving us permission to use a little bit of electricity they have to take that content. And in some cases, people forget the passwords. So they have the box, it has incredible footage, and they can't remember the squiggly line they drew that would give them access to that footage. So you kind of have to work with them on that. This has been mentioned in many panels at this conference, but in Ukraine and in reporting in Eastern Europe in general, Telegram groups, Facebook groups are an incredible source for you. You just need to know which channels to join, and you need to look in the comments. Sometimes people will post, and sometimes people will respond to that post being like, I know where your family member is, contact me. So not only should you find the groups that are relevant to your reporting, in the neighborhoods you're reporting on, read the comments. They're often phone numbers for really important sources. Rely on local officials who know the area and know the residents. In the case of Bucha, the entire town was a crime scene, and there was not one central database for victims. We didn't even know how many victims had been killed in the early days of Bucha. We knew it was in the hundreds. We didn't know the exact number, and there were many lists going around. It was a very decentralized system. The authorities were overwhelmed. So we worked with local officials to remove redundancies from victims' lists, cross-reference names, add names, remove names. So that was a sort of, that necessitated us being able to go into their office with a paper and a pen. You really can't do that kind of reporting over the phone. They just don't have time. I mentioned that you can rely on families of victims to get reporting or documents that officials won't give you, but sometimes they're nice. We worked with law enforcement on many occasions, actually, in this sort of very specific example or a practical example for you. We were trying to identify this victim who was the owner of this car. We didn't know who he was, and so we asked law enforcement to run his plates, and we eventually found his name, and he was Mikhailo Kovalenko. So you can rely on law enforcement in the capacity they can work with you. You'll also find, if you're lucky, and if you work hard enough and are patient enough, sympathetic intelligence officials. These are classified documents that were sitting in an office that are technically illegal to share under an emergency law, under the emergency law in Ukraine. But if you work hard enough with your sources and prove that you're the right person to give them to, you'll eventually get access to some really important documents that either help you that helped us identify victims and really build our chronology. Sorry, Mal, I'm moving quickly. In the case of Ukraine, there are drones flying all the time. Generally, they are flown by the military, paramilitaries, volunteer battalions, so nowhere to look. We, depending on where you are, like I think Meg referenced some human rights groups that flew the drones over Myanmar. In the case of Ukraine, it's often the military, so you can look there for some really critical evidence. Again, most if not all of the drone footage we collected was not available online. We had to, and the war was moving so quickly, or is moving so quickly, that they typically erase their SIM cards pretty quickly to reuse for the next day. So you really need to get there in time. You need to find the right person and get that footage pretty quickly. Nick Waters presented on safety in active conflict. So don't do this. Don't look through the rubble in this way. But if it's safe enough, do look in the rubble, because oftentimes you will find an incredible amount of leftover material. The Russian soldiers are notorious for leaving artifacts behind. They're often running away or fleeing in a hurry, and they're not known to be very clean. So oftentimes there's actually feces in the rubble and in the buildings they occupied. But if you're willing to collect that evidence, it can serve as really critical pieces of evidence. Archivists and war museums. This would never be something I would have thought about. Actually, it was our coworker, Alexandra Korleva, who had read an article in Ukraine about a man who was building a war museum. And she sent it over to us and said, why don't you meet with this man? And we met with him, and he just had a trove of documents he had collected during the first days of liberation. These documents were incredibly helpful. I'll tell you why in the next slide. So sometimes coworkers in New York, and oftentimes your coworkers can be very valuable sources. One controversial, but I think critical place to find or to use a source, or one way to another source that might be controversial but extremely beneficial, are POWs. Whether you agree with me or not, ultimately these are people who are active participants in the ongoing conflict. And if you work with law enforcement, they will potentially give you access to Russian soldiers in Ukrainian custody. Masha and I interviewed about 3 in general, but 2 for the Bucha reporting. It wasn't always very helpful because you don't know if you can trust what they're saying. But in this case, this interview was extremely helpful because the soldier told us the call names or the code, like the call signs or the code names of their commanders. When he told us the code names or the call signs, we realized we had seen those exact call names or call signs and code names in the documents we had obtained from the archivist, the man who was preparing the war museum. And then we realized that we could also hear them in audio from CCTV. So what that did, that interview led us to be able to say that commanders were in fact present in Bucha at the time of the killing of civilians, which is really critical if you're a prosecutor working on a war crimes case, and you need to establish chain of command. I'll skip through these. This is, work with your medical examiners. Often have really critical pieces of evidence if you're reporting on victims of potential war crimes. Using sources to your advantage, I say that very politely. Masha and I and our colleagues have limited capacity, but in terms of how to reach sources. But in terms of, we relied on group admins to post on our behalf. Sometimes neighbors are skeptical of journalists posting on their local groups, asking for helping to identify victims or to find critical pieces of evidence. We relied oftentimes on group admins to post on our behalf in different channels. Okay, like just stop. Like, okay. Yeah. The only thing I can quickly talk about, I'll skip through these slides. This section was going to be on how to build trust with sensitive sources, but I said this earlier, if you are patient enough, you're willing to put yourself in embarrassing situations, go over for tea for 4 hours, sometimes, and you ask the right person for the right data, and you ask for what you're looking for succinctly, you can get very lucky and receive things like call logs, audio intercepts, and hard drives that are classified. So I'll skip through that. And in dealing with victims, obviously there's a different playbook. Here you want to be a lot more empathetic. And they're not just sources, these are people with really sad experiences. The only thing I think I should quickly talk about is that oftentimes man wins in a war against the machine. Malachy talked about scraping. You can scrape as many VK pages as you want. You can automate data. If you get 500,000 phone numbers from officials or a log with 500,000 phone calls, you could potentially automate which person was calling which Russian soldier was calling which family member in Russia. But you lose out on some critical nuances. Had we automated, for example, the CCTV footage, we wouldn't have captured the audio. Like had we used fancy tools to put CCTV in a chronological order, we would have missed out on some really critical audio that established chain of command. So we actually me and my colleagues watched every second of most of the CCTV, 16 terabytes of footage, and it was translated. Only human beings can do that work. I did not do this line of reporting. My colleagues Haley and Christoph did, but the visual quality of the CCTV was very poor, so had you tried to automate vehicle markings, you wouldn't have been able to. You really had to watch the footage to figure out which vehicle markings could tell you something about the movements of Russian soldiers. Patterns in different sources of CCTV footage, the timestamps don't always align, so even if you used a machine to put your footage in chronology, sometimes the timestamp is incorrect, so you really have to look, you have to use your human eye to find similarities in the footage. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Cool. Thanks, you, sir. Thanks, Meg.